It's time to begin the class. And I know where we are. We're on the 40th verse of chapter 6 in the Gospel of Luke. All right. Luke 6:40. No disciple is superior to their teacher. Now, what he's trying to get over here is that you don't need a blind leader of the blind. It's sometimes difficult for modern people, even for scholars, to make the connection here. But having translated all this, you have to make the connection. You have to try to understand what the flow of the idea is. And he used this idea of the blind leading the blind like he does many times. It's almost what I call a signature phrase. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. He applied that in many different contexts. And the blind leading the blind. This was his description a lot of times of false teachers. But here he brings it around to the idea of the relationship between a teacher and the taught. And of course, the primary teacher that he's thinking about is himself. That he is the teacher. And what happens is, and this is altogether too true, both in religion and politics and a lot of places, where the disciple goes beyond his teacher and actually becomes an enemy of the teacher. You'll find that second generation people from charismatic type leaders will be more radical and disruptive or whatever. And that's the train of thought that he has here. So he says, no disciple is superior to their teacher. When a disciple has learned everything the teacher knows. Now, this is a difficult sentence to translate because it should be a kind of, let's say, I can't even remember the grammatical term for it. It is not a direct statement of something. It ought to be, it's almost equal to, if he learns everything that a teacher, then so and so. Do you understand? It's conditional, is what I'm trying to get at. If he should. Now that's the word, when I did the editing of this, I put it in the should. What is that? It used to be called subjunctive, but we don't have a subjunctive in English anymore. It's not conditional, but if this should happen, it would be this way. So neither one is statement of fact. It's problematic or conditional.
Is it like one depends on the other?
Yes, but neither one is stated as a fact.
I actually teach English grammar, and there are 4 different conditionals in English, and there is an unreal conditional in the present and an unreal conditional in the past, where you talk about something that might have happened, just conjecture in your mind, with the result knowing full well that it never happened.
Okay, all right. The only difference that I'm trying to make here is that it couldn't happen. Do you understand what I'm talking about? That this is, this would be an ideal, unachievable. Do you understand what that's the point I'm trying to get? if a pupil learned everything a teacher know, they would, the disciple still, there should be a B there, but what I did would only be equal, or actually he would not come to that level. In other words, no disciple of Jesus ever came to his level of understanding of the will of God. They came close, and I think that probably the one human being that came closest, who would you guess?
Mary.
No.
John.
No. Paul. That's the reason I think God has in the New Testament 12 letters from Paul, that he came the closest, and he knew that he was not worthy to be even spoken of in the same sentence. I'm paraphrasing his statement. But he did. He understood what God was doing in Christ better than anybody. That's the reason that since 1977, the so-called new perspective on Paul has been so fruitful for understanding the overall story of God's activity in the world. And I am so glad. I didn't realize when we started years ago the story idea, that we were on to something that would be very, very helpful to understanding the work of God in the world. It is the simplest, most direct way to comprehend something that in its details are complex, and nobody, no matter whether they're Hebrew scholars, Aramaic scholars, philosophers, theologians, or anything else, can untangle the details completely. But even the most ordinary person, just ordinary street level American or other country, can follow the story. And then the next step is making your story conform to the story. And that's what being a disciple or follower of Christ is all about, is bringing our story individually into do you know that's what Paul talks about in Romans 6 when he talks about being baptized into his death and being joined and dramatically reenacting in baptism the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. That's where our story becomes intertwined with the story of God. And from then on, we should be parallel. We're just like Christ was given new life. Not new life spiritually, but new life in his body. He had a glorified body that we folks will have one just like eventually. And so there is where our story merges with his, and that means the salvation that he brought is our salvation. Isn't that a beautiful idea?
Powerful.
It's a powerful idea, and it helps us understand how we should live. It really does. It's a great lifter. We're talking about not being anxious. If we know that our life is parallel, and that we are participating not only by willpower. You know, that's kind of the thing we've always thought about. We were legalists and didn't know it. We would choose to do that. Well, you have to choose, okay? That's Paul's main thrust in Romans 6. Choose to do that. But it's the choose of surrender to the Spirit. And then let Him, Paul says, it's no longer I that live, but the way Christ living in me. And so, to use, kind of paraphrase Max's sermon today, just relax and let God take over. See, I remember we had a youth minister one time who was one of the best at planning retreats for high school age kids I've ever known. And he had one where he would have somebody stand up and fall back, just go limp and fall back into the arms of another person. Do you know some kids cannot do that? There was a golfer on the golf tournament yesterday afternoon. His name is Kevin Na, and several years ago he got to where he could not strike the ball. He would want to bring the club back, and he couldn't do it. He froze. And that's what people do with anxiety. They freeze, and they can't function. Now, that's a slightly rabbit trail, but it is in the ballpark on what we're talking about here.
Charles, who was that youth minister? I know that's not the...
What?
You just tell the youth minister, who was it?
Agnew.
Okay.
Ronnie Agnew, which means sheep. Agnus is sheep. He went on to become an outstanding lawyer in Lubbock and became a great defense attorney. Since when we moved back here in 91, it was about 92 or 3, he came through and he spent a night and we visited with him. And he was telling us about some of his outstanding cases. And he told about it as many as he lost as he did that won. So I knew that we were getting the nitty-gritty of it. But he had that ability to turn abstractions into bodily actions. And that's a rare ability. It really is. Because that's the way we learn. When our bodies participate, then it becomes ours. That's one of the powers of baptism, is that we participate bodily, dramatically, participatorily, whatever, you can put a lot of adverbs in there. And that's the power of it. Of course, ultimately the power is the Spirit of God working in us. But the way we join ourselves to that is physically participate. That's the reason that if you want people to work together, guess how you get them to work together? You work together. You assign them a task and step back and let them go. And then they will learn. But rabbit trail. Okay. Somewhere along the way, I have to agree with that. I was on an idea, but we'll get back to this. Okay. If I don't know how I translated this last clause, but it's something like this. The disciple would still not be quite equal. Now, is the idea. that's the point that I got off on, was the idea that doing our best, all we can do is participate and follow the teacher. Why do you look for the small splinter in your fellow believer's eye and ignore the plank that is in yours? Now, splinter is the word that Luke uses here. Matthew uses speck, which probably is a speck of sawdust. Think about a fellow. I worked all from February through August one year, 1946, at what they used to call a peckerwood sawmill. That means you do everything by hand. You don't have forklifts and tractors and things like that. And I know about specks of sawdust and planks. And so that's the way I translated Matthew. You have a speck of sawdust in your brother's eye, and you got a plank in yours, and just look at that picture. You got a 4x4 sticking out of your eye, and you're trying to get a speck out of Mark's eye over here. You couldn't even see his head.
I've often had the idea that in that eye it looks small. In front of my eye it looks big. It's the same problem. It's the same issue, but it's bigger. It should be bigger to you before you start, and you should see it first before you start picking it from your brother's eye.
Yeah, Jesus was not. I don't think he was talking about the magnification of closeness, but he was using a metaphor, a figure of speech, and he was a past master at making you think how ludicrous you look, because
Straightening that to the soul.
yeah, that's okay. So that's the image. He's saying that, okay, how can I expect to be helpful to my fellow believers if my vision and my perception is obscured by a greater sin than the one I'm looking for? That's the idea. How ludicrous that is. How can you say to your fellow believer, my fellow believer, let me remove this little splinter from your eye? Hypocrite. This is one of Jesus' favorite words, and the Greek means the false face that actors held over their face. Have you ever seen the false face? They're made out of ceramic. One is comedy, one is tragedy. Well, actually there was 8 or 10 of them, but that was the symbol of Greek drama, was comedy and tragedy, because that was the two kinds of drama they wrote. And so it symbolizes it, and that was called a hypokrites, over the face, a false face. And the actors in the Greek drama had them on a stick. They're made out of white and black colored ceramic, shiny white, shiny black, on a stick, and you just held it up, the actor held it up in front of their face, and that you knew what his character was, what his temperament was. And that's what Jesus used when he described people that don't ever intend to be what they present as they present themselves to be. That's not the act as if principle we talked about a couple of weeks ago. This is to deceive people. This is an act just for deception. You first remove the plank from your own eye. This action will allow you to remove the little splinter from the eye of your fellow believer. Now, you may recognize here where I'm being gender free, because in Greek it's brother, but every place where it is obvious, and it had to be obvious before I did that, every place where it is obvious that it's all believers, then that's the way I translate it, fellow believer, to get that over. Because no matter how hard you try, if you say brother or man in those places, it will feel emotionally like women are being excluded from it, either positively or negatively excluded. And so that's my reason for that. Okay, now we come to his, let's see, what is this called? This is called this is the leading up to the climax. Can't think of rhetorically, there's a word for that, but I can't think of it. What?
Prelude?
No, prelude is opening at the other end of it. Anyway, peroration? Maybe. I'm not sure. What?
Postlude.
Postlude. No, that's after the game. Postlude means a coda after you're through. Prelude, see, ludus is game. Prelude, postlude. Okay. A good tree doesn't produce bad fruit. On the other hand, neither does a bad tree produce good fruit. Now, this is the test of practicality, the test of fruit. Now, fruit here means the results. What actually results from an action, or a thought, or an idea, or a speech, whatever. And it doesn't make any difference what my intention is. It's what results from it that is the way to test ideas. I wish that some of our politicians today could really realize that, because we kind of joke about the law of unintended consequences, but we always think that's somebody else's ideas. Jesus would just be aghast at that attitude. It's mine. He's talking to me as a follower of his, and to you. And just because it's as if I were the only one, that's the way I ought to read it. That's also the way you ought to read it, as if you were the only one. Our tendency is to think, oh boy, that really fits my sister. Or the preacher, or whatever, you know. But it's me. I'm the one. For every kind of tree is recognized by the fruit it produces. How can you tell a pecan tree? It bears pecans. How can you tell the different kinds of olive trees? Did you know there's about 15 or 16 different kinds of olives? Now, if you were a botanist, you could look at the shape of the leaves and the bark or something like that. But some of them, how can you tell a cork tree? What? Do you know what family of trees cork trees belong to? Quercus oak. They're called the cork oak. And if you just look at them superficially, they look just like an oak tree. More like our shinnery oak, the short kind, because they don't get too big. But they're cork oaks. You see get corks off of them, or you get different kinds of olives, or different kinds of cherries. I can't tell one cherry tree from another. But if you wait and get the cherries and eat them, you can. There's sweet cherries and there's sour cherries. There's dark cherries. There's a lot of other. Bing, yeah. And that, of course, is a hybridized product of man.
I just have a question. You said that this is leading up to the climax of the argument. When Luke put this together, when he wrote this, did he take the different parables that Jesus said and then arrange them in a certain order? It's not as if Jesus actually taught like that?
Well, here is the thing. We talked about that a little bit before. These little sections that have the bold are called pericopes in New Testament studies. It means looking at the same thing. And so there is some degree, and scholars argue about this, of arrangement of these pericopes by each individual gospel writer. And evidently, now this is my theory anyway, evidently this is the way the apostles taught the early missionary evangelists about the life of Jesus. They brought them to Jerusalem. You remember in Acts 6 where Peter says it's not suitable, not fitting that we leave the service of the word to serve tables. And so the 7 were appointed there. That is a technical word for the passing on by memory of a body of teaching. And if you think that sounds strange, I've told you this example before. If you want to go to the divinity school in the University of Cairo, the entrance exam is to repeat all 127 sutras in Arabic of the Quran. That's the way you start. The ability of the human mind to memorize is almost unlimited. If you don't have what?
Said you could have fooled me.
Well, the thing is, our ability to memorize is atrophied because we have so many helps to remember that it's like if you don't use a muscle, it'll get weak.
How many of us remember our phone numbers anymore now that they're in these?
What did you say the meaning of pericope was? Looking at the same thing differently?
No, it's just looking at the same thing. And these pericopes, as I said, were memorized, and then the gospel writers selected them. And so you have the Sermon on the Mount in 5, 6, and 7 chapters of Matthew. You have Luke's Sermon on the Plain here in this section of the Gospel of Luke. There's many parallels, but there's many differences also. Now, what we don't know, and scholars can argue till they're blue in the face, and they still won't know. I just don't worry about it. I have an explanation for it, and I've tried to pass that on to you so you can feel comfortable with it, but I just don't worry about it. I take it as it's used in each gospel and try to apply it. But that's what's going on here. And when I say this is leading up to the conclusion is in the 46 through, 49? That's the conclusion. That is the conclusion in both sermons. Because that is the practical application. See, Jesus was a teacher that realized something. A teacher has not taught until it changes the lives of his students. Now, that's not a test that most preachers and teachers really want to think about. But it's the only one. In fact, that's the reason this is leading up to that, because how do you tell what a tree is, whether it's good or bad? How do you tell what kind of fruit of tree it is? It's by the results, what the fruit, what comes from it. And that's one of the things that I have a friend that we're going to have lunch Tuesday, and he and I have been carrying on a conversation about ideology. Now, if you don't know what ideology is, what? Idiotology? Anyway, he thinks that it's a valid way to think about things. I think it's totally invalid. And I've been preparing for that. He asked me a couple of months ago, and the reason it's been so long, we couldn't get together. His job has changed a time or two, and so I'm ready. He didn't know, but I'm loaded for bear. The idea is, ideology is a way not to think. It's a way to decide ahead of time what you're going to think. And that is what has made such a mess out of our politics today. Every politician decides what he's going to be liberal, he's going to be conservative, he's going to be Tea Party, he's going to be whatever ideology, and then he doesn't have to think. He just gets up and or she. I want to be gender free here, and this is leading up to that. That the test is what is really going on. There's a passage where Paul says, it's not what a thing appears to be, it's what it actually is. That's my translation of it. And that is the key. That is biblical realism. The Bible is not an ideological book. And biblical religion, the religion of the people of God, of the God revealed in the Bible, is not an ideology. It is a way of perceiving and living. It's a way of life. Could be called a lifestyle in one sense, but that's a little too restrictive, but that's a fairly adequate description of it. And he's leading up to that. He's saying, look at what really takes place. Look what happens. If a preacher, I'm going to use an illustration I've used before. When I was preaching in Battle Creek, Michigan, the church there had a fairly severe split about 5 or 6 years before. And one of my goals was trying to get them back together. Now, I didn't quite succeed, but after I left, they did get back together. And I visited a woman whose family was involved in the group that split off. And she didn't realize how revealing what she said was. She said, I don't know why it is that every place where me and my family go, they split. See, she could not see that the results were indicative of what they were doing. And that's the thing here. So Jesus, as a great teacher, or Luke portraying him as as the great teacher he was, he starts out by saying about fruit. He said, every kind of tree is recognized by the fruit it produces. One doesn't gather figs from a thorn tree, nor do one gather bunches of grapes from a bramble bush. Good people bring forth good actions from the good things stored in their hearts. This is almost a paraphrase of when he says, talking about what defiles a person, it's not what goes in, it's what comes out. And see how Jesus had these major themes in his teaching, and how he selected in many different ways to say approximately the same thing. It's what I do in this class. That's the reason it takes us so long to get through something. I try to come at it from every direction that I think is relevant to the people who are in this class. And yet I miss some of you. I know that because I don't know you that well, but that's the reason I like to have questions and feedback, so that I know where you're coming from. And I'll try to put whatever I see in the text in a way that is meaningful to you, because that's what I want. I want you to become closer to God in your daily walk. That's the only test that I want applied to what I teach. I want people to walk closer with God and to know the joy of serving the one true God, experiencing the salvation of their lives, not just what we used to call being saved, but the salvation of their lives, the reconstruction of who they are. The most joy I ever got from counseling came from two women, one in the DC area and one from this area, whose they had no sense of self. When I say none, I mean none. Due to physical, emotional, verbal abuse, they did not know who they were, literally. And together, and with the Spirit of God's power, we gave them a self. And they are stable, in fact, more stable than the average bear. Not because I was a good counselor, but because I loved God and helped them take advantage of the power of God. That's all any Christian counselor can do, is direct people to the power of God and help them utilize that power in their own lives. And that's Jesus. That's what he's doing here. Because the mouth of a person speaks out of the abundance of the things stored in their hearts. Then, why do you keep on addressing me as Lord, Lord? Now, this double use of the word Lord, I tried every way I knew how to find a modern equivalent of that. Somebody may can. I couldn't. So I just have to go ahead and translate it, Lord, Lord. It is a rhetorical use, and it means a plea. an appeal. Lord, I appeal to you. Now, here it is used ironically, almost sarcastically, because he's talking about people who appeal to him, who think that they appeal sincerely, and they may be, but they do not want his solution for their problem. Have you ever had a friend who really comes to you very upset, and what would you do in this case? And you give it thought and maybe prayer, and then you tell them, and you find out they don't have any intention of doing what they've asked you to do. Okay, that's all in that double use of the word of address.
It's kind of like, pick me, listen to me, I want your attention, but I really don't want to pay attention to what you're going to say.
It's not a bad idea. Okay, why do you keep on? Now this is Max, when he was talking about the command to continue on, or this is a rhetorical question in the imperfect tense, which means repetitively or continuously, and continually don't do the things I'm telling you to do. Now, it's okay if you don't do what I tell you to do, because I may or may not be telling you what God wants you to do. My sincere desire is to tell you what God wants you to do, but I would not claim anywhere near total accuracy in that. But that's what Jesus is coming from. He can say, why don't you do what I'm telling you to do? That's the appeal, but they don't intend to do it. I will now show you what a person who comes to me, listens to what I am saying, and does them is like. Now, this could be one of the parables.
Would you please explain a little bit about the word Lord there? Because when I see that word Lord, it's acknowledgement that He is truly Lord of my life. And is that how they are actually addressing Him, or is it more of a title?
Well, here is the thing. I think that when a believer uses this, it ought to mean what you said it does to you. That's true. But that's the reason it's ironic here, because we ought to use it intending to allow Him to guide our lives. They were using it not intending to guide their lives. But actually, He is including both those who intend to and who intend not to here, because He's going to divide them into two classes. What I started to say, and this is not criticism for you asking the question, I'm glad you did, is that this could be included as a parable. And there's several parabolic sayings that I'm not going to include in the study of the parables, because if you did, you would be having to analyze about half of the pericopes in the three synoptic gospels. So I decided against that, because it's just too many. But it is in the form of a parable, see? Notice what he says. People who come to me, see, that's the Lord, Lord. They've come to me, who listens to what I'm saying, and does them. See how that connects back to the fruit, the tree image? And he's going now at the ones that listens and does them. Such a person is like a home builder who digs a deep trench and places the foundation of his house on solid rock. Now, if you've ever built a house in San Antonio, you know what he's talking about. This is not exactly what the Greek says. I put it in terms that would be meaningful to people today that use trench and slab construction. So you dig down a trench. Actually, if you're going to do it right, you dig down so far and then you dig a wider place when you get down to the solid caliche rock.
Yeah, if you're this side of the San Antonio River, it's got some rock in it. If it's on the other side of San Antonio, it's gumbo.
Yeah. Well, that's like it is in Houston,
Yeah.
Or in the Gulf Plains all the way up and down the coast. There is no solid rock in Houston. Come in. There they just drive piling until it takes so much resistance, and then they put metal form on top of that, pour concrete in it, reinforced steel and concrete, and that's what they build those big skyscrapers on in Houston. If they ever had an earthquake, it'd be bad because those skyscrapers would come down.
That ground liquefies.
Yeah, it just liquefies it. Okay, thank goodness there's never been a earthquake in the Gulf coastal plains, not in historical times. Okay, he says that digs a trench, places the foundation of his house on solid rock. When the floods come and the forces of the river smashes against the house, always when I see that image, I think about the little creek that's not that too far from our house. I hope to see it that way again. It hasn't been in a long time. But when that comes down and it's got a couple of bends in it, when that water smashes, you better have a solid house foundation. So that's the way they do it. So that's what you have here. You've got a house built on solid rock. Even when the river smashes into the house, it stands. It is unshaken because it was well built. But the person who hears me and doesn't do what I'm saying is like a home builder who built his house on the surface of the earth without a foundation. Do you know that was one of the reasons that so many buildings and homes and things in Haiti were destroyed in the earthquake that was there? The houses were built just on the ground. And as you say, that can turn to liquid in a earthquake, and they just face it.
I noticed, Charles, that you use the phrase "on the surface of the earth."
Mm-hmm.
Is there a reason? I'm familiar with the old sand, built their house on the sand. The word that is, did you translate it a certain way because of that?
I don't think, as I remember, I don't think that Luke uses the word sand here. Matthew does.
Oh, okay.
And I'm not sure how I translated that. I have to go back and look at it, and then I can remember why I did it that way, but just calling up from memory, I can't. No, I don't think Luke uses sand.
Well, I like the phrase "surface of the earth." earth because you get the idea of somebody building their life on carnal, earthly principles.
That I know that was one of the things I had in mind.
Okay.
That the reason I chose to do it that way. Anybody? I thought I heard somebody over here.
The NIV uses a house on the ground.
Yes. That's what I thought. That Luke does not use. He uses a word for ground, earth. It's the soil that he's talking about. See, and that of course is what Matthew's talking about, but he's talking about it in terms of sand, unstable. Actually, you could say on unstable ground. Okay. The force of the river smashes against it, and it immediately collapsed, and its destruction was total. Now, I like Luke's little coda there, because that's very descriptive of a life that has rejected the teachings of Christ. The destruction is total. Mike, this goes back to the idea of destruction of the wicked. And more I have translated the New Testament, the more I see that that's the teaching, that the end of people and things that are against God will be totally destroyed. And then there will be a new heaven and a new earth that is completely permanent, because it is like God made the creation to begin with. Okay, that's the end of this chapter. And we're going to get something completely different. So this is a good place to stop.